On this episode, keeping your kids safe while at school when there's a shooter. Hey everyone, I'm Scott Hughes, and this is episode 16 of the Pondering Prepper Show. Today we're going to talk about teaching kids to stay safe at school during a shooter. Now, a few things before we jump into this episode. I'm not saying if your child does everything correct that we talk about today, that they're going to be safe. There's no way for me to stand here and tell you things that are 100% guaranteed to keep them that way. So don't be naive enough to think that. What we are talking about today will help your kids take steps to keep themselves safe. But as we know in this world, knowledge followed by action can really make a difference. So if you listen to the media, you've probably heard by now that there's been 18 school shootings this year. And if you're like me, when you heard that, you went, huh? How could there be 18 school shootings this year? We're not even 2 months in, or just barely 2 months. No, we're not even 2 months in. And I can only count two of what I consider school shootings. I was going to go over all 18 school shootings that's being reported by the media, but I'm sure you've seen the list. But if not, I'm going to go over a couple of them real quick. On January 3rd, a 31-year-old military veteran who suffered from PTSD, a traumatic brain injury, and depression shot himself in a school parking lot after he called police to report he was suicidal. And from the report, the post, the people that reported this found that that school had been closed down for months. On January 10th, in Denison, Texas, at Grayson College Criminal Justice Center, a student mistook a real firearm belonging to an officer who was authorized to carry the weapon for a practice weapon and fired into a wall. No one was hurt, no one was killed. On February 5th, in Maplewood, Minnesota, a third grader pulled the trigger on a police gun while the officer was sitting on a bench. No one was killed and no one was hurt. Now, the first real school shooting of the year, in my opinion, January 24th at a high school in western Kentucky. 2 were killed and 18 were injured. Then, of course, the latest school shooting is the one that's currently all over the news. Happened last week in Florida, killing 17 people and injured 14 others. I'm not going to get real political here, but the media spewing 18 school shootings is just total BS. And I feel like it's just to scare people and to push their gun grab agenda. And you know what? That's all I'm going to say about that. That's it. When it comes down to these shooters, they all fit the basic profile. They're mentally ill. They're loners. They commit acts of revenge due to society pushing them aside or ignoring them. Over and over, we see these traits in the shooters. But as of yet, we've done anything about it. So there's so many solutions to these problems, but it has to be a group effort. Maybe we do need to make changes to our gun laws. Maybe we do need to add security to our schools. Maybe we do need to start taking every threat seriously. So many maybes. We'll have to wait and see what, if any, make it into law, or at least what people start doing. Before we talk about the kids and their safety, know that most schools hold themselves responsible for the kids' safety, as they should. One good thing some schools have started allowing is for faculty to carry guns. I like the idea, especially when the school provides the proper training for the staff to deal with a shooter. There's no evidence to show the effectiveness of this, but that's basically because it hasn't happened, or basically because it hasn't been in effect long enough. I know one of our local sheriffs here, I was watching the news yesterday, and his department is paying, it was going to be for 50 teachers to come and get their CCW and carry at the school, given the school would allow them to do that. But within the first hour, I think, of announcing this, they were up to 100 applicants, and I think they've now opened it up to 500. And I haven't heard the latest today, but I'm sure it's filled. I also think schools need to have the ability to immediately lock down a classroom from the inside. There's a lot of new devices on the market today that make this possible and are way better than just the lock on the doorknob. But even all that, it's not enough to protect our kids from becoming targets. So let's jump in and talk about keeping your kids safe in the event there is a shooter at their school. The first question you need to ask yourself is, does your child know what a gunshot sounds like? Could they tell the difference between gunfire, a car backfire, a firecracker? Probably not. Most of us really can't. Heck, I know there's a lot of police officers even have trouble distinguishing those sounds. So if someone does open fire in a school, your child's going to have to be able to recognize that the sound is gunfire. If they can't, then their next move will likely be the wrong one. But one suggestion is to introduce them to the sound of gunfire. You can take them to an outdoor range. You don't have to park close. Park far enough away so they don't need ear protection. That way they get to hear the sound in its purest form and not muffled by any earplugs or anything like that. Of course, then you can take them to an indoor range as well. though ear protection would obviously be required in these instances. But even at least they get used to the sound. Once you've introduced the sound and the kids have heard it for a while, they should have at least a really good idea of what gunfire sounds like and be able to most likely identify it, especially in the school setting. Um, of course, most shooters don't just, like if it's a backfire, it just happens and it's done. If it's gunfire, there's usually multiple rounds being fired at once. So they should be able to identify that and then take the appropriate action that we're going to talk about. What is the appropriate action? That might be running away, calling for help, or taking cover. And we're going to discuss all three of those in just a minute. Once your kids have a good idea of what gunfire sounds like, it's time to teach them the difference between cover and concealment. If you've been through any kind of training, you very likely already know the difference. Concealment is just hiding. Basically, it might be under or behind something, whatever that something is. Might keep the shooter from seeing you, but if bullets fly in that direction, it's not going to protect you. Chances are, if it's just concealment, the bullets can go right through it. When you hear, like in the movies in Hollywood saying take cover, that means something completely different from concealment. Cover means having real protection from gunfire or the threat. This could be something as simple as a brick wall. Most schools have brick walls and they're thick enough to stop most common rounds. Some more modern classrooms have metal doors, which could also be a form of cover because they're going to stop, a lot of handgun rounds. Though I think the wall would be better. Teaching the kids the difference in cover and concealment can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're dealing with younger kids. And no one really wants to scare their kids to the point that they're afraid to go to school. The younger the child, the trickier this is going to be. With younger kids, sometimes the what-if game works best because who doesn't like the what-if game? So what if this happens, or what if that happens? Come up with as many scenarios as you can think of and go over them with your kids. Go over them enough so that they remember them and they understand them and they know the difference between cover and concealment. So what should your kids do? Pretty much the same thing you should do or I should do if we find ourselves in an active shooter situation. Basically, you have three options here: flee, hide, or fight. And before we jump in and talk about each one, realize that your child's ability to do any of these will be based on the school's emergency policy and procedures. I do want to say, in my opinion here, that your child's responsibility to protect themselves overrides their responsibility to obey school staff. Option one is flee. The best idea under the best conditions is fleeing the scene. It's the best way to put distance between them and the shooter. Before choosing the flee option, your child will need to figure out where the shooter is. That way they can make a good decision as to where they should flee to. If they are going to run away from the shooter, they need to know how to run. Running in a straight line still makes them a pretty easy target. But if they're zigzagging irregularly, up, down, whatever, it makes them a harder target. And chances are the shooter's going to ignore them. It's just too much moving back and forth. I have no doubt that the school's policy on this is for the kids to shelter in place, hunker down in the classroom. I say if your kids have the opportunity to run and get away from the shooter, the better off they're going to be, and the better odds of surviving this incident. This means giving them the authority to make the decision to disobey school staff and flee if they've deemed it a viable option to get away from the shooter and survive the situation. Option number two is hide. Now, this is probably the option your school's going to opt for. Most school policies dictate the kids and staff to just shelter in place. Take cover in the classroom. My kids, is what they do. That's what my kids' school does. There's a problem with this. Most schools have very few places in a school that provide enough cover from flying bullets. Like I said before, the walls are going to be good enough against standard rounds, mostly handgun rounds. But if the shooter comes in with a rifle or even a high caliber handgun, these rounds could potentially go through the walls. Of course, the furniture in schools will be useless, even the metal furniture. Pretty much any bullet is going to pass right through them. They're just not thick enough. The whole idea behind hiding is not allowing the shooter to know you're there to begin with. Most shooters want to see the victims get hit and die. This means they aren't likely to shoot through doors, closets, walls, things like that. And that brings us to our final option, and that is to fight. This is probably the scariest option for most parents and students to think about. But it is an option that needs to be discussed. It's no secret that our kids can't go to school armed, to protect themselves for good reason. That doesn't mean they can't fight back against the attacker. Now, this option is risky, but it can give them a fighting chance if the shooter is close enough to them. So what happens if a group of kids, say 10 or 20, rush the shooter and tackle him or her to the ground? Will the shooter have enough time to pop off a few rounds? Most likely, yes. Are the odds of those rounds hitting a few of the kids charging at him? Most likely, yes. But are the odds the kids are going to be able to attack the shooter and get them to the ground? Most likely, yes. And if a few rounds do make contact, it's not going to be all of them. In the end, the good guys are going to win. And also save a lot of lives. Like we said, this is the most risky of all options, and I wouldn't recommend using this unless it was the only option. And the group of kids charging had the best vantage point to get to the shooter. Some teachers have been known to keep extra boxes of scissors, staplers, and other classroom tools for the sole purpose of arming the students in this kind of situation with something to throw at the attacker should they enter the room. I know that last option is scary to think about, but it is an option. And I believe most kids, if in a group, would be willing to take down the attacker given the chance. If you elect to discuss this with your kids, be sure to go over all the other options and teach them the safest way to pull something like this off. One more thing we as parents can do to keep our kids safe is to buy them a bulletproof backpack. Sales of these have soared since last week's shooting, and they aren't a bad idea. Now, they are, however, expensive. The best ones sell for over $500, but well worth it if it saved your kid's life. If you didn't want to go all out and buy a backpack, you could opt for buying the ballistic insert for whatever backpack they're carrying. Now, they make these in all sizes, so I'm sure there's one to fit your kid's backpack. If you go this route, be sure to discuss what these are used for. They will stop pretty much all pistol rounds, but the rifle rounds, maybe not so much. In the case of an active shooter, if they run away, the backpack would protect their back. But if they have to hunker down, like in most places and shelter in place, they can place it over their chest or head to protect these areas, as they're likely going to be facing the direction of the door, which is where the shooter most likely would enter. If you watch Demolition Ranch on YouTube, he's one of my favorite YouTubers. You've probably heard of him. He's got like 5 million subscribers. You've very likely seen Dr. Matt shoot all sorts of rounds through reams of paper. So you know that paper can be effective at stopping some bullets. Of course, the more reams that you can put between yourself and the bullets, the more bullets is going to stop, and the larger caliber is going to stop. If that's all they have access to, then it's better than nothing. So again, no guarantee that any of what we talked about today is going to save a child during a school shooting. But one thing is for sure, it will give them a fighting chance and definitely improve their odds of survival. If you like this video, hit that like button. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you know anyone that could use this information, tag them in the comments or hit the share button and send it their way. With that, I'm going to sign off. Until next time, stay always ready, my friends. Take care.